Yeah, so thanks everyone. Also a big shout out to the conference organizers um, for putting together such a great event. I really had a good time over the past few days. As Bartos just mentioned, my name is Nick. I work as an interaction designer, like probably many of you. And I do that at Mirabeau, which, despite sounding like a French company, is actually a Dutch company. We're based in Amsterdam and some other cities in the Netherlands. And we like to call ourselves a digital agency. So where some companies focus on design or UX, and some other agencies may focus on technology, we like to combine the two. So we have a lot of strategists and UX designers, but also people who know lots about things about cloud computing and continuous delivery and all kinds of things that I personally don't really know a lot about. We tend to work for Dutch companies because we're a Dutch agency, but a lot of them they tend to have an sort of an international footprint. So they're globally active. For example, if you look at KLM or G-Star, they're more of international companies. So my talk will revolve around context, specifically context as it relates to digital design and the way in which adapting a product or service to a specific context can radically improve the usability or the ease of use or just plain fun. Now, of course, if you're talking about context and you're talking about design, then you run a risk of getting into cliches because you can't really do any kind of meaningful design work without thoroughly considering the context of use, which people will actually be using your product or service, in what circumstances. But still, I think we can, as an industry, improve the way we look at context and the way we use it to fundamentally redesign and improve our products and services. So it's mostly a talk about digital things, but my first example of context in this case has mostly to do with architecture. So this is a famous, or well, semi-famous music venue in Amsterdam. It's been around for a few years, and I've helped to organize a UX conference here a few years ago. And this is the main hall where we put all of our keynote speakers. And it's a nice hall. It has really great acoustics. The lighting is good as well. So it was very fitted for a UX conference. But what I particularly liked in this case is that this room can adapt. So they can change the people of the venue can change the lighting, they can change the seating arrangement, and all these things can have a dramatic impact on the atmosphere of this building. So whether they're hosting a classical concert or an indie band or maybe a product launch, they can change the whole atmosphere, and it really has a profound impact on the whole atmosphere. Now, of course, this being architecture and a physical building, it takes a lot of manual effort to change the layout of the seats and to change the lighting. But I think the good part of the industry that we're active in is that we can mostly automate these manual efforts. So we can use emerging web technology in the broadest sense of the word to really automate this manual part. Aaron Shapiro, who is the CEO at Huge, a big American design company, he recently wrote a pretty brilliant article for Wired, I think, arguing that our design goal as designers is to use data and algorithms and sensors and behavior to make things happen automatically, or at least as close to automation as we can get. So, well, you can argue that any kind of good design considers context. I would personally argue that great design actually adapts to context. So it goes a little bit step further. And if we do this really well, then ideally this should lead to less work for end users, because we're taking away the manual effort that they have to fill with interfaces and taps and clicks and gestures. But it also means that for us as professionals, we should put more effort in to create these algorithms and to make use of sensors and technology to make our users' lives easier. So to make things practical, let's just look at some different examples of context on the web today. I think Google is, of course, a prime example of a company that's using context in many good ways. They basically built their whole business empire on context, in this case to match relevant advertising to your search query. And of course, they have products like Google Now that really take advantage of your location and the current time of day to make recommendations and generally make you more productive, for example. But even Google, with all their talented engineers and designers, they occasionally mess up. This is the search result I got earlier this week. Just as I arrived in this city, I opened my regular browser and Google clearly thought, hey, you're in Poland, so you must be a Polish person, which I'm clearly not. And of course, this is not really dramatic. I could easily change the language and get to where I was doing. So it's mostly like a minor inconvenience. But occasionally, context gets more wrong, and the end results can be awkward or maybe even a little painful. Because, for example, you're matching the different ads to different videos. Netflix is another one of my favorite examples of a company that uses your context to create a more meaningful interaction or experience. They use, of course, your previous series and films you've seen to recommend new ones. And the funny thing is with Netflix is that these recommendations can be really specific, like this one, for example, which is not mine, of course. Amazon, similar example, they also keep track of the books you're reading to recommend new ones. And Facebook, they use the likes, your location, your friends, your visited pages to present you with a highly customized contextual timeline. So at this point in time, you could safely argue, I think, that a lot of context is being used by like Silicon Valley, big tech companies that try to make use of context. Whereas if we look at the broader industry, people like us, regular UX people and designers and developers, we tend to create maybe dumber experiences or less smart services because we're making less use of context. It's a bit like television, really, where we're sending the same message to every device, regardless of context. And I feel we can definitely improve on that. So let's look at some different examples of context. The first, of course, is screen context. We've been playing around with responsive design for the past 5 or 6 years, adapting user experiences to different screen sizes and making touch targets a little bit larger for specific screens. But I would argue that in this point in time, I think it's safe to say that we've sort of mastered responsive design. There are still a bit tricky parts when it comes to tables, for example, on large screens, but most of all, we've been fairly comfortable with dealing with different screen sizes. Another interesting kind of context is proximity context, what's happening around you on your current location. The Nest, it was featured in a few earlier slide decks today. This is a smart thermostat, and it takes it uses your proximity to the device to really make the experience a lot smarter. So, for example, if you're far away from the device and you can't really see it very well, it just shows just the temperature. Whereas if you get closer and the device senses your proximity, then it might also show things like humidity levels or the current settings or weather forecasts. So they're effectively increasing the information density based on where you are, which is kind of cool. On the web, we can do similar things, and this is where this talk becomes kind of geeky. I recently came across this example, which uses facial recognition to detect your face's distance to the screen and adapt the typography accordingly, which is, again, a little geeky. I haven't really found a particular good use case for this, but I still think it's fascinating that these new capabilities are there. One other interesting kind of context is environmental context. At Mirabeau, we're currently partnering with KLM, where we're designing a suite of smart iPad apps for the cabin crew to help them be more productive and more effective and make their work more enjoyable. And this app has two basic use cases, one of which is this one, where they spend about 15 to 20 minutes before their flight, where they're preparing their flight. So they're reading up on the specifics of their aircraft, their destination, anything that's relevant for that specific flight. And as you can see, this crew center where they're doing this preparation is kind of a comfortable setting. There's good coffee, there's comfortable seats, and so forth. So we really optimize the design for comfortable reading, like long-form reading. Now, if you compare this context to the onboard context, then you come into a wildly different atmosphere, because here there's turbulence, there's bad lighting, there's noise, there's lots of stress mostly. So the context is actually pretty different. And they use the app on board, for example, to prepare the meal service or read out cabin announcements. So we're using this context and, for example, ambient light to really improve the user experience and make the interface and the typography more suited for that context. One last thing I want to show you is behavioral context. I'm a big fan of Airbnb. I'm supposing many of you are as well. And how I typically use Airbnb to find apartments is that I go to Airbnb for a week or 2 weeks, because I tend to be really critical of apartments, so I spend hours or sometimes even days to find the right apartment. And Airbnb is aware of that, that many people are returning to the same website. So they're taking advantage of this and making the UX a bit smoother by, for example, providing a quick list of my recent searches. So the cities and the dates and the people involved are remembered, so they allow me to pick up easily. Now, the irony, of course, is that as designers, we sometimes get stuck focusing on visual decoration, like deciding on whether this specific input field should be a custom input field or be a browser default input field, or whether this call to action should be flat or have a drop shadow. But it's in the end features like this one that really make the UX a lot better. Just one other example. This is a website we made for LeasePlan, which is a Dutch company, again, and they help companies manage fleets of lease cars. And of course, as you see here, the default homepage is kind of standard. There's not much interesting things happening, but it quickly gets more interesting as, for example, as a returning visitor, we're keeping track of the different pages and things you've seen. And for example, when you've been looking at a specific car model, we can show that specific car on the homepage again on your return visit. If we sort of assume, based on your customer journey, that you're up for a new model of car, then we may show specific tools or calculators to nudge you in that direction. So what we basically did in this case is build a design system based on dynamic content and modular components to really enhance the user experience. And this has a profound impact on UX and also on important metrics. A few years ago, this kind of contextualization of products and services would be really difficult. But if you look at, for example, content management systems nowadays, you'll find that a lot of content management systems are actually offering features or modules or services that allow you to make segments or profiles and start to play around with custom content and contextual UX. So these are a few examples of how at Mirabeau we've been playing around with context and anticipating people's intent to really enhance the user experience. But I can imagine, just based on these few examples, that you're like, well, okay, Nick, this is all very cool, but I'm not really sure where to start, because it's easy to get overwhelmed with all these possibilities and capabilities. So what I tried to do in this presentation is give you a condensed version or a quick how-to of our discovery, research, and design process in how we deal with this specific notion of designing for context. At Mirabeau, we don't follow a specific or standard design process. We try to tailor our process to factors like the client's ambition, the team, investment, planning, and everything. All these kind of different factors allow us to tailor the project process. But there are still some fundamental ideas that are inherent to all the projects we do. And I've decided to, for the sake of simplicity of this talk, to nail them down to 4. So the first step in our process is to think big and start small. This is really where we focus on user needs and business goals and focus on the overall strategy of the project. And obviously that involves a lot of research. So we tend to look at numbers and data and analytics and all kinds of metrics that really allow us to get a feel for what is happening to our specific product or service. And of course, this works best if you're redesigning an existing product or service. But we're also pairing the numbers and metrics to more qualitative research. So we're talking to people, we're running focus groups, we're doing participatory design to help translate the findings from the numbers to actual insights and see why things are happening. Now, despite us doing research and doing thorough research, we sometimes have designers or other people who sort of forget the insights. So what we sometimes do in some projects is mapping research insights to specific points of the customer journey, because this makes it easier to remember and refer to specific insights as we go along in the project. So for example, we can use sticky notes or other ways to capture specific insights like user needs or business goals and put them in the right stage of the customer journey. So for example, if a specific product or service, we learn that when it comes to payment, consumers may be willing to pay with credit card, for example, because that's more convenient for them. When it comes to business goals, we can do the same thing. So we can map business goals on specific stages of the customer journey. And doing this often leads to interesting insights. For example, the company we're working for may actually not want people to pay with credit cards because it hurts their cash flow or whatever reason. And often these contrasts between user needs and business goals, they provide really interesting input for discussions and thoughts. Also, what we often find is that the best ideas, the most interesting product propositions, and like radical innovation happens at the intersection between business goals and user needs, which is kind of obvious if you think of it, making products that people want, but also makes sense from a business perspective. But doing this kind of research mapping really helps to get a feel for where the real value is. And of course, we can only be innovative and fast and bring things to market if we choose focus. So we can only do a few things at once instead of focusing all our attention on 12 different things. So we spend a lot of time on research and strategy and coming up with a good proposition. The second step involves defining the core, which is, of course, a bit abstract. So let me explain this by referring to an example. This is the e-commerce platform for Transavia, which is sort of the EasyJet, but the Dutch version. Actually, they're kind of between EasyJet and premium airlines, so they're between low-cost carriers and premium airlines. And we spent the last 2 years fundamentally redesigning their whole e-commerce platform, which was a really cool project because the board at Transavia decided to have a rebranding sort of halfway through the project. So at some point we were involved in designing the actual aircraft livery, which is pretty cool if you're working at the digital agency. And at some point they asked us to help redefine or redesign the online seat selection experience, which is where you get to pick your seat, which is a really important application for this airline, because a lot of revenue nowadays for airlines comes from upsell. So they're really encouraging people to buy better seats, more comfortable seats, because that's where the revenue is nowadays. And this is what they tend to look like, right? They're like floor plans of aircraft, and you can pick your seat. So this is a really important application, but we're also facing like an overload of different devices, form factors, different kinds of interactivity. And from the outside of the project, we really wanted to make it work everywhere. So whether you have old hardware or the latest MacBook Pro, this seat selection should work everywhere. But we're also aiming to use context to really enhance the experience. So in this case, what we do and what we do in general is refer to a design philosophy that's called progressive enhancement, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. And in its basic form, progressive enhancement means not making assumptions. So we're not making assumptions about people having the latest hardware, or having JavaScript turned on, or having a reliable connection, for example. We're just creating a basic version that works across all browsers and all platforms. So in practice, that means we're using the basic building blocks of the internet, like radio buttons, select boxes, paragraphs, really basic stuff. So we're creating a simple, accessible experience. And to demonstrate why that's important, does anyone of you have an idea what this is? You can kind of take a hint from the color scheme, like yellow and blue. This is the new Ryanair website, and which is actually pretty cool. But the development team decided to build the whole thing in Angular, which kind of not works if you don't have JavaScript. You might at this point say like, well, why should I care? Because 97% of people are actively having JavaScript, so it's only a minority. But today we're dealing with people who have content blockers, for example. So they're not just blocking tracking scripts or JavaScript, but also images and web fonts and all the things we use in our design to make pretty stuff. So the variability of the web is only increasing, and we should be aware of that. So going back to the Transavia example, this is what the seat map looks like if you have like a 7-year-old phone with a small screen running an ancient version of whatever browser. And we won't win any Webby awards with this one, we are aware of that, but we're still offering a suitable experience to old hardware. Whereas if you look at this same page, the same application, using maybe a more recent iPhone with a better browser, the experience will be slightly better and more suited to that specific device. Now, if you're presenting these kind of ideas to design managers or marketers, they may say like, well, but we're creating 2 versions of the same application. People will be confused. Guess what? No one cares. 0% of your visitors or your users will care about cross-device or cross-platform consistency. And in that statistic, product managers do not count, of course, because they care usually. So instead of focusing too much on pixel perfectness, we tend to focus on purpose. So we tend to focus on what's really important, what's like the core of this application, rather than just making something that works only in the latest browsers. And actually, this whole idea of progressive enhancement is really liberating, because instead of making a design in every browser and making it appear the same, we can just get away with a basic experience in like Internet Explorer 8 or 9, for example. And it allows us to move on quickly with really fascinating stuff. So once we have this core that works everywhere, we get to play with context to really enhance the user experience. So in this case, when it comes to the seed map, and you're using a big cinema display with a recent version of Chrome, for example, we go crazy with like visual effects. We use WebGL rendering, CSS transitions, Google Maps, parallax scrolling, all kinds of decorative stuff that really enhances the experience. But of course, doing these kind of things is pretty has a lot of impact on processors and batteries. So in this case, when this application detects that you're running low on battery, which we don't want, the interface automatically scales back to a more simple yet usable experience. So we're also using things nerdy APIs like battery status, which really enhances the user experience. Now, if you're interested in these kind of geeky technologies and web APIs, then I can recommend this website. It's called caniuse.com, and it basically shows a plain list of all the different obscure, exotic, and emerging technologies. And for each one, it shows the current browser support. So you can decide whether for your audience, be it like early adopters or maybe senior citizens, you can decide whether it makes sense to support any of these. Finally, in our design process, we focus a lot on testing and continuous improvement. I think this is a chart that will make Jeff very happy, based on his talk this morning. We don't run projects with a formal start and with a formal ending. Instead, we focus on partnerships with clients, and we try to create a continuous cycle of improvement. So actually, the first launch of every product is just the first launch, and we're entering this cycle of continuous improvement, where we design, learn, and ship new features, and quickly see whether they hold up to scrutiny in real life. Part of that workflow is also to do with dashboards. We care about data and how important metrics influence the user experience. So we're constantly monitoring like engagement or sales or conversion or bounce rates, all the kind of metrics that make these people in suits really happy. So it's like analytics and dashboards. But of course, numbers only tell part of the story. So we're also using user testing really often. So what we do is invite 7 or 8 or 9 people into a usability lab and let them test drive the whole experience. So again, combining the numbers with qualitative research really helps to make good stuff. Now, if all this led you to believe that our work for Transavia is like the best in the world, it's clearly not. We also screw up occasionally. This particular bug had gone unnoticed for 6 months in a particular version of Chrome. And especially in this case, it was kind of awkward because you could actually be seated outside the aircraft. Fortunately, people got to our attention on Twitter and they actually allowed us to fix it. So we also stumble and we fail and we try to improve ourselves. So wrapping up, designing for context is all about user needs and business goals. It's about designing this specific core that works across all platforms and devices. It's about enhancing and polishing that based on browser features. And it's about testing and learning and improving. So over the years, as we've become more experienced and knowledgeable about designing for context, we've accumulated a set of design principles to sort of guide our efforts. The first of which is we try not to take things away. based on context. This still happens a lot, most obviously in the mobile space, where I frequently, and I guess the same is true for you, end up using mobile products that don't work because either the designer or developer or product people didn't really think mobile was an important platform, which is of course completely stupid. This is an interesting example, I think. This is a German startup, and they have developed a mobile product that allows travelers on the German rail network to travel together so they can buy group tickets and they can save money. So of course, this is really a mobile product. You would say mobile first, for example. But in this case, this particular company decided to go mobile only. So when you visit their website on a really big cinema display, they're saying, well, yeah, sorry, we didn't have the time to make a compelling experience for big screens, which was kind of a MVP trade-off, I suppose, but it's still kind of funny. So instead of taking features away from people, we tend to reprioritize content. Second design principle kind of ties in with that. We should always allow overrides, because even if we have the smartest engineers and the most talented designers and craftsmen, it's really easy to get assumptions wrong and create algorithms that create like stupid services. To illustrate that, this is a sketch or a prototype we're working with KLM. This is a flight tracker, which is a web application aimed at friends and relatives of people traveling. And KLM, when it comes to aircraft, they have like literally hundreds of data points. They can show the exact geographical position of the aircraft, the speed, the flight level it's flying on. But what we got from research, obviously, is that most people, like regular people, actually tend to care about whether it's on time, when it's departing, and when it's landing. So in this design, we sort of put that content in the center. But in this case, we went a little bit further, and we decided to make use of context, in this case, location context. So for example, if you're looking at a flight between, let's say, New York and Amsterdam, and your physical location is New York, we can sort of assume that maybe you're dropping off relatives at JFK Airport, for example. Whereas if you're looking at the same flight at the same time in Amsterdam, we can maybe assume that you're picking up people from this flight. So we're showing the arrival time rather than departure time. But of course, these are all assumptions, so we can't really be sure. So in this case, we also built this panel that you can pull up and then show all the different data points we have, like all the departure and arrival times. So it's really crucial when we're developing and designing for context that we're clearly showing what's happening and we allow customers and users to override our assumptions in case we're wrong. Last design principle is about creepiness. I think a lot of other speakers have already touched upon this subject. My favorite example is Spotify. They had a little of a PR disaster last year where they basically rewrote their privacy policy because they wanted to enable people to have better song recommendations. So what they did is give themselves access to whatever's on your device, not just the songs you're listening to, but also photos and your location and movements. And people have objections with being tracked for all kinds of reasons, even if it involves like terrorism. But Spotify chose to violate people's privacy for song recommendations, which is kind of trivial. Another example, my girlfriend and I are kind of lazy people. So when it comes to using devices, we just basically grab the device that's nearest to us. So I frequently end up using her phone and she uses my MacBook and whatever. And in this case, she used my MacBook to search for high heels, which is like the biggest cliche in the history of cliches, but here it is. And I don't know whether she actually ended up buying high heels, but what I do know is that in my browser, For the next few days, I kept on seeing the same pair of heels on every page. And maybe if you look at the perspective of the e-commerce party, it makes sense from a conversion point of view, but it also kind of crept me out because I felt I was being tracked and being followed. So as designers and developers, we really should pay close attention to the benefits of our services versus the potential privacy cost. So rounding up, design principles, we should never take things away. We should allow people to override our assumptions and to definitely not get creepy. Now, one thing to wrap this presentation up, a brief look at the future. The future is getting really excited. I think you'll all agree with me on that. The web will be coming to more and more devices, be it printers or wearables or cars or refrigerators. Actually, when I saw this picture a few years ago, when it first came out, it's made by Brett Frost, which is, and actually I've always thought that this particular refrigerator is kind of a fake product. But guess what? It's actually a product you can buy today. Samsung's made this Wi-Fi enabled fridge, which you can use for cool features like checking your Dropbox or reading Evernote comments or all kinds of digital interactions, which is pretty cool, right? Maybe not. So I think as designers and technologists, we should be really careful and not put screens everywhere, but really focus on added value and the ecosystem of how different applications and platforms work together. This is another ridiculous example. This is a wine bottle with a touchscreen and Wi-Fi. Cool, right? Or not? So this allows you to see what wine you're drinking, where it comes from, complimentary food, for example, all in this fancy touchscreen UI. And this thing cost $190, which is ridiculous because the added value is pretty small, apart from it being cool technology. Same thing with wearables, for like Google Glass, for example. Also, in this case, as designers and developers, we should be really careful about social implications and things like privacy and the ethical context, because we have lots of different kinds of technology, powerful technology, but we need to make use of it in a good way rather than getting creepy. We're quickly entering the age of conversational interfaces. So instead of visiting a product or a website or an app, for example, we will in the future be more like communicating with brands and services in chat applications. KLM last week, they launched a way to communicate with KLM in Facebook Messenger, and not just communicate, but also check in for your flight and get your boarding pass. And basically, this is just the beginning. Lots of different new ways of interacting with brands and services will follow. But I think in general, we need to be aware of the risks and potential things we can do wrong, because in general, as technology blends into different aspects of our lives, we need to be more aware of context. So there will be more devices. Gartner predicts that in 2020, there'll be 26 billion different smart devices, anything from wearables to Wi-Fi enabled wine bottles maybe. And I don't know about you, but for me, if I read about 2020, it feels like the Jetsons age, like flying cars. But actually, we're talking about just 4 years from now. So the future is really here. Also funny is that the projections are actually variable. So for example, Cisco says that in the year 2020, there will be 50 billion devices. And then there's companies like Intel, they say, no, there will be 200 billion devices. But I think rather than focusing on projections or debating about numbers, we should ask ourselves a much more fundamental question, which is, are we ready for this new future? Are we ready to design for this new future? Thanks.